Floating platforms for people to sleep on. And it's called platform. Yeah. It's gonna be lectures here. I think the first bit was doing all first was I got the books that was the author. That'd be wrong. Yeah, you're wrong.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the start of the 2023 Food for Thought schedule at the Department of Archives and History. I believe this is our 34th consecutive year of this program, so we are very excited to start a new series. And if you've been with us for a while, you know that in January we like to do an early Alabama history topic, and we like to feature an old friend of the department as often as we can. And we certainly are doing both of those today. So I am more cognizant than ever of the fact that you want me to get away from this podium and Catherine to come up. So I will give you some very brief announcements, but encourage you to sign up for our email updates, which we'll be getting the one in February out in just another week or so. And that will give you everything you need to know about a very busy month at the archives. And also to sign up to receive our quarterly publication Present and Past, which will give you even more information about what's happening here at the archives. On Saturday, the February 4th, we are set to host the return of a favorite program here. That will be the Rotunda Sing, the Shape Note Sing that has happened here for many years. That's sponsored by the Alabama Center for Traditional Culture. That starts here in our rotunda at 9:30 and will go through the early afternoon. If you have never been to that event, you will want to come. If you can just imagine about 100 Shape Note singers in our marbled lobby, it is quite something. And as I said, a favorite event of the folks here at the archives. So we're happy to have that return. On Monday, February 6th, we'll have an online program, a continuation of our research rundown series, talking about ways that you can conduct research at the archives. That program will be on the topic of African American historical research within the court records that are held here at the Department of Archives and History. On Saturday, February 11th, we're going to have what we're calling a celebration of Black history at the Alabama Archives. That starts at 10 a.m. That's a family event. It goes all day long. Starts at 10. There'll be tours, scavenger hunts, a special book reading with special guests, and will culminate with a talk by Shelley Stewart. Shelley Stewart was a radio personality in Birmingham during the 1960s and 70s, and his talk coincides with our Alabama Radio Moments exhibit. If you have not seen that yet, it's up on the second floor to the right of the elevator. I encourage you to go take a look at that special temporary exhibit. It is on view through the end of May. Our next Food for Thought program will continue on February the 16th, Thursday, third Thursday of every month at noon. And our special speaker that day will be attorney Fred Gray. So you'll definitely want to come out for that, hear about his life's work in civil rights. Proud to introduce our speaker for today, Catherine Holland Braund, who prior to her 2020 retirement was the Hollifield Professor of Southern History, Auburn University. She retired in 2020. She holds an MA from Auburn and a Ph.D. from Florida State University. Braun has co-authored or authored and edited numerous books on southeastern Indians, the Federal Road, and William Bartram. She's editor of a new volume entitled The Attention of a Traveler, Essays on William Bartram's Travels and Legacy by the University of Alabama Press, newly printed by the University of Alabama Press. Still has that new book smell, Catherine. We've got some copies available in the museum store, so you'll want to get a copy of that today and have Catherine sign it for you. I think just finally, few scholars in the last several decades, I think, have contributed more to the work and the success of the Alabama Archives than Catherine Braund. She's a longtime supporter of this agency. She's a past president of the Friends of the Alabama Archives. She was an integral part of the planning for the Museum of Alabama, and she has supported this agency in many, many ways. And one of the ways, of course, is she raised up, and I think that's the right word, raised up an entire crop of young scholars and public history practitioners who we benefit from today, including Alex Colvin, who usually stands in this very spot. Our public programs coordinator is a Catherine Braund doctoral student. So we are ever so thankful to you for all your many efforts over the years, and look forward to your talk today and look forward to welcoming you now. Catherine Braund.
Thank you, Scotty, and that was very nice. I appreciate that very much, and I am a big fan of the archives. I like to think of it as the home of history in Alabama, and it truly is. And so thank you all for coming as well. My talk today is a little different because I have some personal stuff I'm going to throw in, and I wanted to tell you about how I met William Bartram. I met William Bartram in the bicentennial year of 1976. Don't go back and figure out how old I am using that, but those of you who are sitting in the audience will no doubt remember the big brouhaha over America's bicentennial and how we all wanted to find things to celebrate. Well, I ran into William Bartram at Dothan, Alabama's National Peanut Festival, where I was taking in the sights with my father. Now, that's a strange place to meet William Bartram, and I have to say, I have accompanied Bartram to many odd places since then, and I guess I should clarify, I didn't actually meet Bartram there, but rather I met his most famous botanical discovery, the beautiful flowering tree, the Franklinia, you see pictured here, and that's his drawing of it. Now, at Dothan, I'd never heard of Bartram, never heard of the Franklinia, but as I recall, it was the Tennessee Valley Authority that had set up a display table, and they were handing out these little twigs. They were about that tall, not a branch, just a little twig in a pot, of what they declared to be America's bicentennial tree. They actually called it the Ben Franklin flowering tree. So my father and I became owners of this little baby tree, and despite our attempts to follow the 2-page instructions that accompanied it, our little twig did not make it. I am very devastated. I have killed numerous Franklinias since, and you can ask me why that is later. But as we were slowly killing our Franklinia in South Alabama, there were certainly more lasting Bartram things afoot in our state and region. In November 1975, the year before, the first meeting of the Bartram Trail Southeastern Conference had gathered in Montgomery. And this is the group on a field trip to Jasmine Hill Gardens in Wetumpka. And note, they're all women. There were a few men, notably Milo Howard, who was then director of the State Archives and also represented the Alabama Historical Commission at this meeting. But these people, mainly women from all walks of life across the South, got to work, and they were interested in formalizing a regional effort to study and mark the route of the 18th century explorer William Bartram. So that was a big deal for Montgomery. But there were even other things. Two of my favorite Bartram ladies are pictured here, and I'll loop back to them later. The lady on the left, the beautiful lady smiling so beautifully, is Martha McInnes, and she eventually became the executive director of the Bartram Trail Conference, and Verta Horn. Now, Verta is interesting to me because in 1973, she had convinced Rosalie Durden, who was the president of the Garden Clubs of Alabama, to present a resolution to the National Council of State Garden Clubs calling for the establishment of a Bartram marker program. Did any of you here know Rosalie, Miss Durden? No? She was a Montgomeryan. Okay, this resolution passed that Miss Durden put forth with enthusiasm, I might add, and the project to set out historical markers noting Bartram's southern tour across the South in the 1770s became the bicentennial project of the Deep South region of the National Council of State Garden Clubs. So the Garden Club ladies took the lead, and I'm sure many of you, if you've traveled anywhere around, have seen a Bartram Trail marker. Now in Alabama, the Alabama Historical Commission took the lead in the Alabama markers, but you can see this is an example of one, and I want to call something out that will be that I'll mention later. And this is one in Florida on the St. Johns River at Spalding's Upper Store. That's just about the southernmost point that Bartram managed to get. And you notice this fellow up here, he looks, you can tell who he's taking orders from, right? That's a garden club lady. These women did a whole lot of good across the state in many ways, in ways that we wouldn't imagine. And this was a time when women did not have a lot of political power, but they wielded their power in many other ways. And in this effort to mark these historical sites and preserve them, they became champions. Another thing was going on while my little Franklinia twig was dying. The Garden Club of Alabama was planting a liberty tree in honor of Bartram. And I want you to, when you leave, go across the campus of the Capitol and look at it. You see these ladies here in March of 1976 dedicating this tree to a pioneer naturalist and botanist who explored the southern part of the United States. And there's that little tree, and there it is a couple of years ago. So it has prospered, and that was a liberty tree the Garden Club of Alabama planted in honor of Bartram. So things were getting rolling just as I was entering college and working on my MA and Ph.D. And as many of you know, my first book, Deerskins and Duffels, was a study of the creek deerskin trade. And during the course of my research, I finally got introduced to Bartram's book and Bartram's travels in earnest. And I found him to be a first-rate historical source. I didn't have any interest really in the gardening at that point, since I'd proved to myself I wasn't very good at it, killing his Franklinia twig. But I did find that his work was very useful as I was trying to describe the method that goods were transported in and out of the Creek Nation and so forth. He provided information in unique and interesting ways that you couldn't find anywhere else. And here's one example, and a very important one. Because early in 1775, Bartram and a young Creek man were heading up from Mobile to the Creek towns on the Tallapoosa River, and they were in charge of loading pack horses of trade goods onto a raft that they had to manufacture in order to get across a swollen river. It had been a very wet November and so forth. And in his book, Bartram provided exacting details on exactly how people in the 18th century constructed rafts by gathering dried cane, limbs, grapevines, and he discusses the manner of building the first floor, the second floor to make it stable, of pulling it back and forth across and so forth. So for somebody who was interested in trade and travel in the Southeast, that was invaluable to me. And he informed his readers, and I'm going to quote, he's talking about they've loaded all these goods on the raft, trying to get them across so they don't get wet. He said, the last load with other articles contained my property, with all my clothes, which I stripped off except for my breeches, for they contain matters of more value and consequence than all the rest of my property put together. Besides, I did not choose to expose myself entirely naked to the alligators and serpents in crossing the flood. So I also discovered Bartram had a bit of a sense of humor. Now, that piqued my interest in alligators, and I'll get back to that later. But time passed, and my wonderful colleague, Greg Wasilkoff, had the idea of producing a book on Bartram's writings on the southeastern Indians. And at that time, Bartram was best known as a botanist. Very few people had considered him an actual source, but we believed it was time to highlight and assess his contributions to ethnohistory, and we did this book, which is still available if you're interested in the sacrilege that we did, which was we threw all the botany out and just kept the history stuff. But it was this book that brought me to the attention of the Bartram Trail Conference, which had by that time been chugging along since the mid-'70s. And they invited me to discuss our work at a conference they were having. And so at last, I was not only traveling with William Bartram and his friends through the 18th century, I had found fellow travelers in my own time. And I joined the BTC, as we call it, and eventually served as the president for 10 years, and I still serve on the board of directors. And the Bartram Trail Conference, I'm going to give you a pitch here, is an eclectic collection of people. There are scholars, there are hikers, gardeners, birders, preservationists, environmentalists, teachers, students, literary scholars, artists, kayakers, archaeologists, you name it, we got them. And I think if you haven't joined us, maybe you should become one of us, because we do have a lot of fun. And it's easy to find information about the conference. You can just go to bartramtrail.org and you'll get right to the website and find out all kinds of information. So all that aside, well, who was William Bartram really? And what did he do to attract all this attention? And what have his modern friends had to say about him and his life's work? Well, Bartram is a much older man than the one who swam across the river, Alabama River tributary in the 1770s. But William Bartram was a native of Pennsylvania, and he set off for Philadelphia in March of 1773, heading south. He was a self-taught botanical artist. His trip was funded by a wealthy London patron, Dr. John Fothergill. And Bartram was in search of rare and useful productions of nature. What they really wanted were ornamental plants for English gardens. He embarked on this journey, which ultimately came to something on the order of 2,400 miles. And you can see here on the purple line where he went. And it's taken a lot of scholarly work to really trace that using his writings in his book. That's 5 of the British colonies and the territories of the 3 largest Indian tribes in the region. He eventually published an account of his journey in 1791 after the Revolution. It was impossible to do anything while the American Revolution going on. So Bartram was not only an artist and a botanist, but he was a writer of unparalleled merit. His sheer delight in discovery and the breathtaking descriptions of the beauty as well as danger he encountered were energetically transmitted to readers then and now in prose that one scholar aptly characterized as possessing a wondrous kind of floundering eloquence. And that really, for me, describes Bartram to a T. As another famous literary scholar observed, Bartram's Travels is one of the most delightful books anybody ever read. And I think you can figure out I agree. And Bartram described a lot of things, not just the plants and animals and natural wonders, but the people he met along the way, the British administrators, the Indians, the enslaved people, tavern keepers. He described them all. The shame of things is that his book faded from public memory in the late 19th century, aside from the interest of botanists and biologists. But it was republished in 1928 by Mark Van Doren as part of a very little series of little-known works by early American writers. But it was not until the middle of the 20th century, in 1958, that a seismic shift in Bartram awareness came through the efforts of Francis Harper, who not only located and edited the manuscript journals of William and his father John, but produced what remains the standard edition of Travels, the Naturalist edition, which is a very heavily annotated version, and it was published, as it says there, by Yale University Press in 1958. And it is still available. That volume is still available as a used book or by paper through the University of Georgia Press. So you can certainly find many copies of Bartram's work. Now, as we've seen, the enduring appeal of Bartram's work for Southerners manifests itself spectacularly during the lead up to the bicentennial of the American Revolution. Because in Bartram, people in the South found a connection of their region to these monumental events in the colonial and revolutionary period. Southerners were always focused on the Civil War, and here all of a sudden was a feel-good colonialist, right, that went right through the heart of 8 Southern states, and his appeal was nearly universal. He delighted historic preservationists in Charleston who had houses he'd stayed at, environmentalists, conservationists, tourism and directors across these states, and of course the gardeners who had always been fans of Bartram. And so when those groups came together in the 1970s to form what we called the Bartram Trail Conference, they really got to work to identify historical and natural landscapes associated with his tour that they could preserve and promote for tourism and educational activities. And they also worked to secure national recognition through the National Park Service for his route as a national recreation trail. There were also plans for hiking and canoe trails and that sort of things. Now, the National Park Service did not like this trail. They had a very restrictive criteria for what should be a trail in that point in time. Nowadays, it would be no trouble. But then they just didn't see these far-flung sites as being a trail, part of their trail model. But that didn't matter. And in some ways, it's probably a pretty good thing, because what happened is state, local, and private entities began to work and make it known that their site had a Bartram connection. And in Alabama, we have a number of major sites. The Tuskegee National Forest highlighted a hiking trail they called the Bartram Trail. Fort Toulouse-Jackson Park used to have a Bartram hiking trail, and Bartram did visit there. It was abandoned by the French at the time. It was the abandoned Fort Toulouse when he went there. And the crowning jewel of Bartram sites in Alabama is maintained by the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the Five Rivers Delta Center. Has anyone been there? Yeah, it's great. There are hiking and canoe trails. And it's really, it's a wonderful place. So through the efforts of the Bartram Trail Conference, maybe they didn't get the national trail, but they certainly got a lot done. And I'm happy to say that from the beginning, the Bartram Trail Conference had the unswerving support of the Alabama Archives. And this institution is the official repository of Bartram Trail Conference records. And you can get early reports and all that kind of thing. If you want to see them, they're here. And also, I couldn't resist this. The Archives has hosted several Bartram-related events, including 2 of our conferences in recent years. We're probably the only organization in the country that puts a pickled rattlesnake on our banquet tables. We had a scholar who gave a talk on Bartram's rattlesnake observations. It's been since published in a very prestigious national journal. And of course, that's the cannon that's on display in the Museum of Alabama that Bartram actually saw. So the Archives has a really special connection to Bartram. And most importantly, I think it was an impetus to Bartram's scholarship, all this emphasis on these specific places all across the South and the various ways that he wasn't just a botanist, he wasn't just a crank who wrote flowery, books, but he was a really important source and study. And the BTC now has a Fothergill Award, which supports research on any topic related to William Bartram, and that rattlesnake paper was one of the things we did. And scholarship from the Bartram Trail Conference started early. The Bartram Heritage Report was the first publication. It represented the initial work of a national team of Bartram promoters and scholars who undertook the initial trail study. And there are many specific technical reports all here in the archives if you're interested in looking at them. Prominent in that generation's work was Martha McInnes, then the chairman of the Bartram Trail Conference, and a very young Dr. Robert Peck, who also contributed to my recent volume. Bob Peck wrote that, and he is with the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. He came down and spearheaded this national effort to do the report. By the way, if you're interested in reading that, it's hard to get. There are only 1,000 copies. Sometimes you can find them as used books, but it's available online as a PDF through Google Books or through the Bartram Trail website, and it's very interesting. The second volume of BTC-affiliated papers came with a book that I helped edit, Fields of Vision. It appeared in 2010 and represented scholarly works represented at Bartram Trail events. And I'd like to call attention to the cover. That's Bartram's drawing of the large flowered evening primrose, which grows only in one specific place in the country, and that's in Alabama's Tensile Delta. And the Bartram's garden people on a field trip down here, Bartram Conference, were able to find what one of my friends calls a ditch plant and take it back to Philadelphia, which now it is again blooming in Bartram's garden. That plant has a very interesting history because it was sold as an ornamental in France and naturalized and changed slightly in Europe, and it was eventually used in genetic research. So Joel Fry, who's from Bartram's Garden, has a very interesting article on the primrose and how it has continued to be important through history in Fields of Vision, and I highly recommend his paper. Also in that volume, we had an article by an archaeologist, Craig Sheldon, many of you will know, on called Where Bartram Sat, and Bartram described the architecture and layout of Creek towns, most of which has been confirmed by actual archaeological work, and that Bartram's description was also used in constructing the diorama in the Museum of Alabama on a historic Creek town. So we have an eyewitness account. So Bartram and the BTC really work to bring scholarship and people together, whether it's in the garden or in the museum. And we're still at it. That's the third book, the latest collection of essays by Bartram scholars. And it features essays on Bartram's trip through the Creek Nation in Mobile. And I'm very proud to say one of my Ph.D. students has a Fothergill scholar. He had an article in there. And Bartram's exploration along the Mississippi. There are works on Bartram's art and literary approach, on Bartram's ties to slavery, and a very detailed census of remaining surviving copies of the 1791 edition of Travels, which book people like. And very importantly, two essays that focus on the history of the Bartram Trail Conference and the work in intervening years. So I'm very pleased with the essays. They're all by people I've worked with for years, and I think they're very good essays. There is also, naturally, since the Franklinia is on front, an essay on the leading expert on the Franklinia, Joel Fry from Bartram's Garden, he who wrote about the primrose in the other book. And this tree was actually discovered in 1765 by John and William. John Bartram was William's father, and they made a trip to East Florida when it first became a British colony in the 1760s. And the tree is very interesting because it is a beautiful flowering tree, and it has a lovely aroma. but it's largely extinct in the South now, and it's kind of hard to figure out why. Scientists disagree on exactly why that is, but it is certainly one of America's most celebrated plants, and it does grow very well in Philadelphia. So if you're ever at Bartram's garden, you be sure and look for it. And I really enjoyed working on this book because not only the fact that I knew so many of the people, but they were really good friends and scholars that I respected over the years. And so I hope if you get a copy that you'll like it. My contribution to the book is called Wrestling with Bartram's Alligators, which was a little bit outside my wheelhouse. But why not? Why did I wrestle with gators being an FSU person? I used to have this wonderful, this is, I'm probably going to go over time, Scotty, but what the heck. I used to have this little pin that FSU people would wear, and it had a picture of a gator. He's stuck full of arrows, and it says, "Gators suck canal water." So, that's an FSU joke. Anyway, here's why I tackled Bartram's alligators, because from the beginning of my research talks on the Creek Indians, and I would quote Bartram, people would inevitably come up and ask, are the alligator stories true? Well, I could confirm his historical observations, but I didn't know anything about alligators, so I really wasn't able to answer except get very defensive and say, of course they're true, and people would raise their eyebrows. So I started doing research, and thanks to the work of excellent modern biologists, we can assess the quality of his alligator observations, not simply as great literature and adventure, but also what he got right and what he didn't. And during his time in the South, from North Carolina on, Bartram encountered plenty of prodigious large alligators, as he put it. Most famously, he rode into a battle with them on the west side of the St. Johns River in Florida. Hundreds of alligators, group feeding on trout. They nearly overturned his boat. It's an exciting story. I recommend you read it. But as numerous writers have observed, and Bartram's alligators have fascinated everybody, not just me, his alligator stories are the most exciting, most dramatic, and certainly the most controversial part of travels. And these controversies really call his honor into question. And also, they lead people to say, well, if he didn't get that right, and if he exaggerated here, what about the other things? And so I tried to untangle that problem. So my work in the essay, I'm not a biologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I wanted to place his observations in the context of his time and summarize the findings of biologists in regard to the accuracy of his observations. One of the things I wanted to know was, why would anybody in their right mind row a little boat into the middle of a lagoon full of alligators? And I assumed, and still do, that Bartram was in his right mind. So I started looking at, what did people in the 18th century South think about alligators? They were everywhere. They were more everywhere then than they are now. And long story short, the idea was they're not very fast on land. You can outrun them. You get a stick and poke at them. So don't worry about them on the land. In the water, stay in a boat. And if you're going to go swimming, as the Indians always did, or you're going to get water like people do, just be careful, because humans are too big for alligator to mess with. There are plenty of other things. Don't let your pigs and dogs near the water. But just be careful and you'll be okay. So that made me feel a lot better about Bartram's sanity in this thing. So I did a lot of research on his various observations. This is one of the two drawings, by the way, he did of alligators. The alligator hole, he describes it in Travels, one of these Florida sinkholes. He's better at botanical art than alligator art, by the way. So today I want to just go over two things that people ask about. And the first is the size of Bartram's alligators. Now, what Bartram said about how big the gators were that he saw has been the target of frequent skepticism. He mentions alligators of vast size, monstrous size, prodigious large size, large as the trunk of huge trees. It goes on and on. He's clearly impressed. And he wrote in Travels, I have seen them 20 feet in length, and some are supposed to be 22 or 23 feet in length. This is much larger than modern gators that we see. By the way, that I stole this picture of Westmore at Alligator Alley. I don't know if you've been there, but they have some alligators there. And like Bartram, he's not afraid of alligators and just uses his hat to shoo those gators away on land if they come after him. But 22 to 23 feet raises eyebrows. Now, let's just take a minute here. Bartram was in a boat, and all of his estimates were done by eye. He doesn't mention how he measured them or if he actually measured them. And he certainly didn't have a steel rule to go tip of snout to tip of tail like scientists do with dead gators now. So these are by eye estimates. And it's only recently, by the way, that there's been agreement on how you come up with the length of an alligator. Well, consider this. And this is alligator. You think Bartram was being overcautious swimming in the Alabama River. This is a world record long gator from the Alabama River. And that thing was 15 feet, 9.25 inches, ventral length of 15.5 feet. Okay, so that's pretty good. So we're getting about nearly 16 feet, and Bartram said he got one of 20. So it's not as bad as you think it is, really. Scientists really, we have to look at modern gators versus 18th century alligators because scientists have yet to fully account for how overhunting in the 19th century, environmental degradation, familiarity with humans, and modern hunting practices, which have been geared for over a century at taking the largest specimens, might skew the maximum size of alligators in our own time, not to mention they seldom get to a certain age. Thus, while Bartram's ocular estimate might be on the high side, the method of actually assessing length, as well as the existence of larger individuals prior to the near extinction of the species by overhunting in earlier centuries, means Bartram's estimates were likely not as outrageous as they might appear. And there have been other reports of 19 feet and so on. So stay tuned. We'll see how long the Stokes alligator lasts as the longest on record. But the thing besides size that people really get excited about is the smoke-breathing alligators, right? Smoke-breathing alligators. And there you see. Now, at some point in May 1774, William Bartram, and I'm going to be quoting from him, found himself on a beauteous isle. He was preparing for a restful evening after an eventful day in which he had spotted wild lime and lantana while botanizing. What a wonderful day for a botanist, 2 new plants. As he reclined under a live oak, the balmy, gentle breeze carried the animating breath of fragrant groves. All the trees were in bloom, a nice smell. The surf lapped against the shore. There was a rustle of birds taking roost for the night. And he remembered that he had had that night a sweet and refreshing repose in that Eden that was Florida. That ended at sunrise when the thundering crocodile, as he called them, began to roar. Now, Bartram, like everybody else in that period, called alligators crocodiles interchangeably, but he's talking about alligators. Bartram tells us that the dreadful roar at dawn is re-echoed for hundreds of miles all around, and the coast and bays and lakes tremble from shore to shore. You can begin to see why people raise their eyebrows a bit, right? And in his published account, he noted their terrifying roar most resembles very heavy distant thunder, not only shaking the air and water, but causing the earth to tremble. And when hundreds and thousands are roaring at the same time, you can scarcely be persuaded but that the whole globe is violently and dangerously agitated. Okay, all right, that's a little hyperbole, but he's an 18th century man. He's not used to the noise of jet plane engines and traffic and things like that. And this is in a natural setting. And by the way, there were literally hundreds of these alligators around at the time. But what do we know about this thunder? Well, alligators do bellow in the spring, primarily at mating season, and that's what Bartram saw. Bartram wrote that they clap their jaws together and it causes a surprising noise like that which is made by forcing a heavy plank with violence upon the ground and may be heard at a distance. Well, he's right. One modern biologist tells us the hollow, muffled sound of a a huge crocodilian smashing its jaws closed is singular in the natural world. And what Bartram was hearing was what scientists call now, in a very scientific way, vocalizations. These are part of their social displays, and that includes the bellowing, the jaw clap, and also head slapping on the water and on ground. And bellowing, which is a better term than the thunderous roar, serves important social functions in the alligator's world. It provides auditory and visual clues to size, sex, location, and even possible social position and territory. And it does cause the water to rumble, and you can feel the vibrations on the ground when these very large alligators do that, especially if you're in a Florida wetland. So Bartram's account might be a little over dramatic, but it is essentially correct, and not just because I say so, but there are biologists who say so, though it's certainly less detailed and specific than the extended studies of modern biologists who note these sophisticated demonstrations include at least 8 different components and do include both audible and subaudible sounds. So there are sounds that we can't hear, but other alligators can. And when they bellow in unison, as Bartram witnessed, they have been clocked to be as loud as the engine of a small airplane with decibel meters. So they are quite loud. So while his emotional descriptions of the range and power of the bellowing is somewhat overstated, others have noted that it is essentially correct. And in fact, one biologist said you could really hear them fully a mile distant. So it is something to hear and see. Now, no part of Bartram's alligator account has caused as much derision as his account of vapor or smoke produced by these alligators. And here's a detail of that. And Bartram wrote that he saw clouds of vapor issuing from their wide nostrils. And he described this here in Travels, which you can follow along. Behold him rushing forth from the flags and reeds. His enormous body swells. His plaited tail, brandish high, floats upon the lake. The waters, like a cataract, descend from his open jaws. Clouds of smoke issue from his dilated nostrils. The earth trembles with his thunder. And he is describing alligator behavior properly when they draw in their bodies, their heads and tails go up, they pull in air and water, and then they bellow. It's actually called HOTA, head oblique, tail arched. And this is this little drawing here has been called by one art historian the most famous and important drawing executed by Bartram. I think that would start a fight with the botanist who would say the Franklinia probably was. But anyway, it was actually sketched in 1774 and sent to Dr. Fothergill, and Bartram repeated his observation, saying that this illustration represents the action of this terrible monster when they bellow in the spring season. They force the water out of their throat, which falls from their mouths like a cataract, and a steam or vapor from their nostrils rises like smoke. Okay. People have been skeptical of that, and one of the reasons is because of overhunting in the 19th century, nobody was actually able to witness this behavior for a very long time. And I'm happy to say that the leading herpetologist at the University of Florida, and if you want to read a really good book on alligators, it would be Kent Fleet, and his career has been devoted to studying alligator biology, and he was actually the first to photograph this smoke and explain that it's not condensation like some people tried to say. What it actually happens is water vapor is produced in the alligator's lungs, and when he bellows, that comes out and appears as steam. And American alligators are not the only alligators who do this. Chinese alligators do this as well, the only other place in the world where there are alligators as opposed to crocs. And the Chinese actually associate this with foretelling rain. So they do emote something close to a vapor that's coming from their lungs. Now, my time is growing very short. Otherwise, I would recount Bartram's famous battle with numerous alligators in a Florida lagoon on a fishing trip. I'd recount his observations on alligator group feeding, which, by the way, inspired a scene in a James Bond movie, if you think Bartram doesn't have tracks. And also his observations on the tender care mother alligators provide their young. It's the truth, they do. I might well recount the interpretations of literary scholars about his alligator stories. Some of them are outrageous. I just had to laugh. Some are very quite quite perceptive. But let me close by noting modern herpetologists agree that on the whole, he got more right than wrong. And I don't want to leave you thinking everything was right. He did make a mistake about the skull articulating in teeth and funny things like that. I'll leave it for you to read my essay in full, as well as travels, to fully appreciate Bartram's alligator stories. But I will conclude with a touching assessment of Bartram's observation by a woman who knew him. And women have been particularly attracted to Bartram from the beginning. All right, we're in 1817 now. And Dr. William Baldwin, who is a retired, I think he was a naval physician or whatever. Anyway, he makes a botanizing trip to Florida, and he's on Bartram's trail. He's looking for some of those early plant discoveries, and he's got a copy of Travels, and he encountered one of Bartram's acquaintances as well. He ran across Marguerite McIntosh Spalding. She was the widow of James Spalding, whose famous store is marked on that sign I showed earlier. Spalding was the owner of Indian trading stores on the St. Johns River, where Bartram visited on his journey. His base was kind of those stores when he was going up and down the St. Johns. And Mrs. Spalding told Baldwin that she remembered Bartram very well, and she told him his account of alligators is not exaggerated, and that from a woman who lived on the site for many, many years. So I'll let a Bartram woman have the last word, and I hope to see you on Bartram's trail soon. And I'll be happy to answer questions if we've got any time left.
All right, terrific. Well, we do have some time for some questions, and we'll encourage our online audience as well. If you have a question for Dr. Braund, you can put that in the chat feature. We'll get to some of those. And we have a request, Catherine, to start with from one of our South Alabama listeners who's watching online. Could you back up to the slide that has the websites on it so they can see those once more?
Yes.
And then we'll start here with our first question in the audience.
I hope I can answer it.
I noticed that it says courtesy of the British Museum below some of those pictures.
Yes. Well, here's the deal. Bartram had a modest stipend from John Fothergill, a London physician. He had one of the largest private gardens in England. And so his reports, his letters, and many of his drawings went to England because he had people there who would pay for them. And so that was that was sent to Fothergill, and eventually at his death went through several hands, but ended up in the British Museum. And Bartram, many of the botanical specimens he collected. He did send some live plants out of Pensacola, out of Mobile, out of Charleston, but he also collected botanical specimens and dried them in the field on paper, and those are available as well at the British Museum. So we have a copy of for instance, the primrose that he collected on the Tensaw near Robert Farmer's plantation down there, and it's in the British Museum. So many of his journals are there as well. So that's how they go.
Another question from the audience?
I'm wondering about the native shrub or tree, Fothergilla.
Uh-huh.
Was that named for Dr. Fothergill?
Absolutely, it was. And the gardenia was named, there are some conflicts, but for Alexander Garden and Charleston physician. So a lot of these names. And what's very interesting, and one of the reasons I really like Joel's work, particularly on the Franklinia, Bartram's work became sort of pushed aside because of the American Revolution. A lot of the American plants, particularly American trees, were very important in English gardens, but the American Revolution sort of severed that ties and gave the British a bad taste in their mouth for things American. And one of the problems with the Franklinia was getting it recognized. Bartram wanted credit for for finding this beautiful tree, but the British didn't like it because he'd named it for Benjamin Franklin. Obviously, they, had a problem with that, but there weren't any really good specimens. And so it's an incredible tangled story about how this tree was named. And so Bartram is finally getting recognition for it, even though he wasn't the first to publish it. And he also is not given credit for the discovery of the alligator, because he didn't name it. He gave a description, but he didn't name it, and that was left for the French to do. But they had help from Bartram. Andrew Michaud took a specimen back and traveled with him. So I mean, a lot of the problem with Bartram is that we would know him a lot better in scientific circles if he had just gotten things into print. But he was a very modest person, and he was waiting for the experts to give him the new binomial names and so forth. So it's very interesting in that regard.
If you could have talked at dinner with William Bartram after his trails and had conversation, what would you have asked him, or what would you ask him?
Gosh, that's flooring me. I think I just sit there smiling. I do have, at one point in time, I would have certainly asked him quite a few questions about Native Americans. He travels is actually written in 4 parts. He has different journals, and then the 4th part he actually has a separate title page, and it's his observations on the on southeastern Indians, and it's written in a very different style from the journal part of his book. It's written in a more detached, scholarly fashion, less flowery, more direct. And he also has other papers he wrote on the Native Americans. But I think I would certainly, let me recover myself here. I would have asked him about some of those individuals he met in detail. He leaves out many names. He does mention some, but I would press him on these individuals and who he was traveling with and that sort of thing.
I had not heard that there are only alligators in this continent and China. Any guesses as to how that came about?
Not a clue. Of course, there are crocodiles all over the place, and there are certain differences between alligators and crocodiles. But I have on my shelf a whole lot of books. I don't remember recalling. I think it's just how it worked out. And there is an American crocodile down in the very tip of Florida and so forth. But Bartram never got that far.
This period of time that he was doing this was truly the frontier time. How did he find guides to take him into really unknown territory?
Well, it was unknown territory to him, but there were many Indians living there, and he was traveling on trade paths. For his trip down the St. Johns, he was traveling with deerskin traders by boat who were going up and down between Spalding stores across. Let's see, which way is the map? When he was coming across Alabama, well, from Georgia on down here, this is a major Indian trade path. And when he came through our part of the world, through Alabama, he was with a caravan of deerskin traders and pack horses on a very well-known path. And he did usually have guides. There were points in time, particularly in Florida, when he was ensconced at Spalding store or different places. He would go out on his own. Singly for day or short excursions, but for much of the time he was traveling, especially overland, with other people, primarily deerskin traders. And I have to say it was a fairly dangerous time to travel because the American Revolution was breaking out, but also there were hostilities between the Creek Indians in Georgia over a major land cession in 1773, and that held him up. And that's one of the reasons he went to Florida. Fothergill kept saying, go further north, we want plants that'll grow in England. But he was drawn to Florida, had lived there previously in the 1760s. So he knew his way around, but there were well-traveled paths, and he did have guides, occasionally Native American guides, in some instances, the son of one planter in another. So he had some help, but he was alone for parts of it. But most of the time he was traveling with pack horses of people, especially overland. Just a good question.
It was. We have another good question online from our friend Forrest Latta. He says, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And has the Franklinia tree been grown successfully in Alabama? And where can one be seen?
Well, yes, I think there probably is somebody in Alabama. I just don't really know about them. One of the ladies who was president of the Bartram Trail Conference early on had a big one in her front yard in Pensacola. I have a colleague who lives over in Macon, and he bought at an auction a little tree, and I kept saying, "So how's your tree coming on?" And he would hem and haw, and then finally said, "I'm embarrassed to tell you, you've killed so many. I don't want to show you how well mine's doing." And he had planted it. My friend Brad Sanders, who did some of these maps, he's got one on his patio in a pot. I know people tried in Alabama, and one of the leading theories about what happened to them is that where cotton is grown, there's a certain virus or whatever that gets into this tree. I don't know if that's true or not. They do not do well in clay soil. I can also tell you this, because I put one in a pot, and they are very popular with deer and every other kind of insect that eats plants. But I don't really know of where one is. There's a beautiful one at Bartram's Garden. There's one on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. They're here and there in arboretums. And one of the Fothergill scholars was actually doing a census of the Franklinia trees and doing genetic research and attempting to figure out, what you could do to make them more successful as ornamental trees, because they really are beautiful. But as far as I know, I don't really know anybody who's got one in Alabama. You just have to, keep trying.
You had a question over here earlier.
I don't think they like humidity, to be honest with you. I mean, the one place in Georgia they found them, you can't find them there. They were extinct in the wild in the early 19th century. Baldwin was looking for them. People have been craving this tree, but it doesn't do well. Oops. It doesn't do well, my Lord. It doesn't do well overseas either. The French didn't have much luck with it. So here we go. It's the first time I've ever done that.
How often did he walk the same trail? Did he do it one time, or
Yes.
did he go back and forth?
Well, he did it let me put it this way. He made several excursions along the coast. And one of the problems that scholars have had is untangling his journal, because he left his journals in South Carolina when he went back north in 1776 for obvious reasons. The war was breaking out, shipping was going, he had to get home. So he writes the book later on, and for one reason or another, probably for narrative improvement, he conflates some of his trips. I did this and I did that, and it looks like it's one trip, but it's actually two, because you can't go and get seed and also see something in flower, right? You have to see the flower and then go back and get the seed. So there are occasions when he did that, particularly in Florida and along coastal Georgia. But when he came up to and there was an early time when he was around Augusta, he was with a crew of surveyors when he was doing that, surveying that land cession that ultimately led to trouble between the Creek Indians and Georgia. But when he came across most of Georgia, Alabama, and this way, it was a one-way trip. He got on a little sloop and went to Pensacola. That was a day trip. And then over here. So it was there and back. And it was really rather through Alabama, particularly this trip through here, where there was absolutely nothing. There were no towns, no Indians, nothing. It was really hasty, and he was quite upset about that, because he wanted to have a more leisurely pace and botanize and enjoy it. But there was also a war between the Creek and Choctaw Indians going on over territory, so he had to hurry along with the caravan for safety reasons.
The tree, is it related to anything else?
No, it's yes, it's in the tea family, the camellia family, I think, but it's distinct. So it's a real mystery. Sounds like a baby alligator trying to get in.
We had one more question here. This will be our last question.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
How could a traveler in the 1700s carry enough money, and in what species, to get by for a long period of time?
Very good question. He didn't carry very much money because nobody was taking money. What he did when he traveled through the Indian nations was he purchased things to trade for food and so forth. He was widely welcomed by the native people who called him Puck Puggy, the flower hunter. They recognized, as one of my fellow Bartram Trail people noted, that he wasn't out for anything. He didn't want their land. He didn't want their women. He didn't, he was just there to observe. And he was welcome. And he brought small bits of tobacco and things like that to trade for good. He carried a rifle with him. And when they were out on the trail, they lived off game and fish and so forth. I have an interesting, I thought it was interesting anyway, article in Fields of Visions on Bartram's diet when he was on the trail. So when he was in towns, he did draw money from Fothergill, a very little. And my friend and fellow Bartram scholar Thomas Halleck thinks that some of his financing might have been through the sale of an enslaved woman before he set out. He had been given this woman in payment for a debt, and so his family sold that person, and Tom thinks that probably helped financing. But he did have money to draw on from Fothergill. He had an agent in South Carolina, Dr. Garden, and they frankly were saying, you're not spending very much money. But honestly, if you're wearing deerskin breeches and you're just living off the land, it wasn't a very expensive trip. But your question is very, very good, and I have sort of tried to figure out. And maybe I'll live long enough to do it, exactly how much it would have cost in terms of exchange of goods and things like that. I mean, he would buy cheese and occasionally to take with him, rice, which you could get easily and cheaply in South Carolina, and he would stew up trout. One beautiful meal, he was on one of these, about the time he has fun with the alligators, he's stewing up trout with the juice of oranges and limes and rice. So, he ate pretty well, I think. He was a pretty good cook. Stuffed birds, trout, it's good.
Another round of applause for our speaker,
Thank you, Scotty. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I damaged the equipment.
Well, it's a good time to point out that our Food for Thought series is brought to you by both the support of the Alabama Humanities Alliance and the Friends of the Alabama Archives, a group that Catherine has led ably in years past, and they pay for our programming. They help with our exhibits. If Catherine had broken the microphone, they would have paid for a new one of those. So we thank you so much for coming back today, and we look forward to seeing you all again. We have a full slate of events in February. We look forward to seeing you all for those, and especially on the 16th, back for our February Food for Thought with Attorney Fred Gray. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.